So hello everybody and welcome back to this module on MBA Marketing Management. So if you cast your mind back to the first session, we spoke about strategy, strategic management and touched on the differences between policies, tactics and strategies. This module is purely focused on policy, so creating policies and everything we need to know around that. So before we continue and move on to the next slide, have a think about policies that you've come across and then just consider how easy do you think it is to create an effective policy. So you might just want to stop the video here and just have a little bit of reflection. Policies that you've come across, whether that's contracts that you've signed that that include a policy, or remember when you go and book a flight and it talks to you about the airline policy, or maybe studying at the business school, the policy that they have in place. So think a little bit about, do you think it's easy to create an effective policy? So answering that question in more detail, some of the rules for creating effective policies that we need to be aware of are around the fact that writing policies are inherently a little bit risky. So it's a risk communication exercise that is performed frequently by people who lack the skills needed to create a good security policy. So fortunately, the use of a few best practices for planning and writing policy can make a huge difference in its effectiveness in reducing risk. So some of the challenges and issues, what do you think they are? Because obviously it's inherently risky. So what do you think are the key challenges and issues in writing a policy? So have a little think about it and we will continue. So some of the key challenges around writing policies are that, for example, security policies are developed by the security team in isolation and alienate the rest of the organisation, which can potentially lead to high levels of resistance and counterproductivity. A rigid policy unnecessarily removes our ability to consider multiple options to hard or complex problems. Another key challenge regarding to policy writing is the fact that policies which are badly worded can introduce problems such as inconsistent policy positions, the inability to ensure compliance, unacceptably high risk profiles or unnecessarily high costs. And security policies that are not adapted to changes in the business environment or the external environment will become obsolete and restrict business development. So now we're a little bit more aware of the key challenges in writing a policy. What would you recommend to overcome these difficulties? So what do you think needs to be in place to help us counteract these problems that we've highlighted here? So stop the video for a few minutes and just pause to consider. So to overcome these difficulties, things that we need to recommend involve developing and maintaining a policy as part of a process. So we need to engage heavily with stakeholders who are affected by the policy because this will build support and improve policy quality and pragmatism. We need to ensure that our policy is flexible enough to support the array of risk appetites that may exist within our organisation. And we need to have our policies drafted by someone with competence in policy development. The rules are only as strong as the text that expresses them. And we need to make sure that our policy is pragmatic by testing it out. So what do you think is involved in developing a policy? What do you think are the key steps that we should follow? So have a little think about that while you're reading the recommendations. So when we are looking at developing and maintaining a policy, we should definitely approach it as a process. So it is a bit of a mistake to assume that you can successfully develop policy by having a knowledgeable person compose a document in one sitting in isolation from the rest of the organisation. This will alienate the rest of the organisation and lead to high levels of resistance and counterproductivity. And successful policy outcomes almost always require consultation and iteration before a final sustainable policy position is drafted. So if you can't defend your process, you can't defend your policy. And once your policy is published, it should be reviewed occasionally, for example, every 3 years, and it should include a consultation with other stakeholders, internal and if necessary external, along with an assessment of issues that have arisen since the preceding review. So the characteristics that are processed in following this and making sure that we adhere to following the correct procedure in actually developing the policy should have the following characteristics. So as we mentioned earlier, we should have an iterative approach. So it's not really feasible to write and enforce every potentially useful policy at once. So starting with a small body of the most necessary policies and building on that over a period of years will result in a more effective body of policy. Another characteristic is that we should base policy on business risk priorities. So it's not necessary to address every possible form of loss through written policy. This results in too many policies. We need to choose our battles and keep the body of written rules to a minimum by addressing only the most highest impact areas. And also, during the policy writing process, we should keep notes, and an explicit written goal for each policy element should be included during the creation of the policy and the review process, and it should be filed for further reference. So it's preferable to include the goal as a normal part of the published policy as an awareness building mechanism. Notes relating to the reason for the policy and its goal should be kept as background material for review cycles. So notes are especially useful during policy revision and include the source of borrowed text and discussions over choices. Unused policies, along with an explanation as to why it was not used, can also be stored as a reference for future questions and possible future use. And what we also need to think about is using a structured approach to support flexibility. So large organisations normally have a number of semi-autonomous business units, and without careful policy coordination, such a structure results in an overall increase in risk. So acquisitions, widely varying lines of business and distribution across multiple countries, are all facts of life that encourage battles over policy. It can take many years to eventually arrive at policy consensus on some issues. So, can we think of some examples in this area? So, for example, when we talk about these semi-autonomous business units, they're all going to have different risk appetites. So one example, for example, is a bank where a retail banking division will be far more risk averse than an investment banking decision. The policy, therefore, must be sufficiently flexible to accommodate these different risk appetites without compromising the entire organisation. And then a policy that is too rigid in its approach or its implications can be just as problematic as a policy that does not result in sufficiently strong security controls. So for this reason, it's really important that the policy emphasis is on risk management rather than compliance to a prescriptive set of controls. And this can be achieved through the use of language. So for example, substituting should, using should instead of must, or through the policy structure, for example, devolving some policy requirements to guideline level. What we're going to go through now is I'm going to show you an example where we demonstrate that, and we work through an example of the policy and all the different subordinate layers to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So if you take a look here at this diagram, if I explain it a little bit more in detail, going from the charter through to the processes, this is one of the ones that we actually saw in the last module. What do we notice? Well, we notice that we've got at the top, we've got a charter. So the mandate for the policy is provided via this charter. And because the policy has been signed at the very highest level of the organisation, the authority that it carries is preserved in the lower, more detailed levels that the CEO does not need to see. Then working our way down, we then have standards. So the standards describe the functional requirements that must be universally met with no exceptions other than via a formal exemption process. Guidelines are almost exactly the same as standards, and those follow, except that individual business units are free to deviate from the guidance without seeking formal approval. Then working our way down, we've got this idea that actually by doing that, this is the mechanism through which a minimum standard of security can be assured while still allowing for flexibility amongst those divisions that have different risk appetites, as we saw in the example of the bank. So what we do need to be thinking about is we shouldn't ever develop our policy in isolation. We should build support by a process of engagement. So policies require universal support, and they include and accommodate relevant audiences across multiple business units. So policies can be undermined if the stakeholders affected by them have not helped to shape the outcome. So strong business unit resistance may lead to reluctance by the CEO to approve a policy, and even if the policy is approved, the security team may have a long and unproductive arguments with business units about how to implement it or how to comply to it, rather than more satisfying and productive discussions about how security can help achieve future business aspirations. So it's really important there that the focus is on doing the right thing at the start, because otherwise time and energy is spent, as it says, talking about compliance and implementation rather than looking ahead at creating or achieving future goals. So who should be consulted then in this policy? What do you think? So we've talked about the stakeholders, but who are the people who should be consulted in drafting a policy? So basically, it's necessary to consult with each business unit that is affected by the policy if the policy is to be politically and pragmatically viable. So we need to consult widely with stakeholders, and especially the following. So in terms of the following considerations, we need to consult widely with the stakeholders, and what we need to be doing in these situations is actually identifying instances of potentially unacceptable policy outcomes, such as in the banking example that we discussed. So this can be particularly important in those instances where business units are distributed across different jurisdictions, and they may have different needs and different abilities to impose controls. So in these kind of cases, the global corporate policy can only address those few things that are applicable across the entire organisation. So we also need to focus on the fact that every part of the organisation needs to be consulted, but also that the policy implications are very well understood. So we consult with every part of the organisation, and that people and the different business units and teams and departments really understand. So once approved, there can be no complaints that this is a surprise. So it is effectively a part of the awareness and education process. Another thing we should focus on is making sure that we build coordination among business units that might otherwise operate in ignorance or defiance of peer business units. And this ensures that a rogue business unit is not allowed to operate with a security profile that would otherwise introduce unacceptable risk to the other business units. And then, other than consultation during development, we should also ensure wide-ranging support at the senior management level prior to seeking final approval from the CEO or equivalent position. And so when we're talking about these areas that we need to focus on and who should be consulted and who is involved in this, who do you think should actually write these policies? Who is going to be responsible for ensuring that they are written and drafted correctly? So stop the video for a minute and just think a little bit about that. So what we do need to make sure is when we have a policy drafted, it is drafted by someone with competence in policy development. So the rules are only as strong as the text that expresses them. So policy is a really important form of communication about risk, and the impact on the reader will be maximised if the text is well crafted in organisational appropriateness and writing style. So what do we mean by that? So in terms of writing style, Gartner, which is an American research and advisory firm, reviews policies on a very regular basis, and it tends to be obvious when a policy has been written by a person who is not experienced at drafting policy and who has, for example, maybe primary skills in a different area such as technology management. So what's really important is the person who drafts this policy has, at the very least, or has the policy that has been developed by, or at the very least reviewed by, someone with expertise in drafting policy. And we need to develop guidelines for drafting policy documents. So we're going to provide you now with some examples of the guidelines or the guidance that may be included. So we need to make sure that when we are following these guidelines, we need to make sure that we take into account the mindset of the reader. So decide what specific effect a policy item should have on the reader and keep that purpose in mind while writing and editing. Another consideration is to avoid obsolescence. So policy text that's highly specific in terms of dates, service or product names, personal names, etc., can easily become very quickly outdated through changing circumstances that have no material effect on the policy. So the policy needs to be kept generic enough to avoid the need for trivial changes. Another consideration is to make sure that we use a consistent level of abstraction. So requirements documentation can range in abstraction level from a very general statement of purpose that is signed by the CEO to detailed specifications for registry settings on a specific instance of Windows. So treating your policy documents as a hierarchical set of separate documents, as we saw in the image earlier, will make the policy more accessible to the reader and will help maintain it. And another important consideration when drafting policy is to make sure that it is direct and specific. So make it clear what is to be done and who is going to do it. And then other considerations in terms of the language is to really avoid the use of legalese and pompous language. So policy writers sometimes get concerned that plain language will lack impact. And actually it's the opposite, because when attempting to influence people, the more clear we can be and the higher level of clarity, the easier it is to understand. So using pretentious words such as whereas and therefore, or mimicking contractual language by using two words when actually one will be enough, sends the message that the writer lacks confidence in the innate importance of the policy. Another thing in terms of writing the policy, we need to make sure we stick to a consistent style. So there are very subtle differences between should, must and will, and therefore it's important to choose a verb and stick with it. And also use a consistent person. I'll be saying you, they, one, and etc. And then finally, once that's been all put together and written in the most effective way possible, then what is really important is that the document is really edited very carefully. So subject matter experts are not always the most effective communicators, so finding a skilled technical writer to ensure that the final document commands respect from the reader is actually really important. So have the policy reviewed by several members of the target audience to ensure that it is clear and realistic. And then what do we need to think about? Well, if we're writing for an international audience, a multinational organisation, for example, has no choice but to make compromises in the communication of IT governance policy. It's not realistic to expect that the larger body of IT administrative policy, let alone standards and guidelines, will be translated into every national language, although it is normal to translate a small amount of user policy into multiple languages. And of course, English has become the default language for IT in many organisations. So what do we need to bear in mind in terms of the use of language? Well, as we discussed before, the avoidance of legalese, being specific in or being consistent in the types of verbs that we use, and really keeping language simple. So keeping sentences short and words short, avoiding slang, avoiding culturally specific references, and whether or not a document is translated, the simpler it is, the more likely it is that it will be correctly understood by non-native speakers. And another important consideration is to make sure that a native speaker reviews the final document. So countries in which English is widely spoken inevitably develop their own idiosyncrasies that are not understood by outsiders. For example, Swiss Germans refer to servers as productive systems instead of production systems. So in any country, there's always going to be regional variations and development of a language that is used, which is perhaps a little bit based on local variations and vernacular. So what's really important is that those are understood in the sense that it's understood and reviewed by somebody who's a native speaker. And then remember that language usage is not consistent between countries. So the languages named after England, France, Spain, Portugal, China and Germany can vary significantly when used in other countries. For example, the verb to table has opposite meanings in the US and the UK. And then what's therefore important is to make sure there are representatives of each region to review the final document, because language problems go in both directions. So even text that seems very simple and clear to a native speaker may contain a concept that actually is easily misunderstood by other cultures. And then therefore it is important to take time out to learn about the cultural and environmental differences, because every country has its own forms of control and methods of mediating disputes, and its laws reflect that. So there can be significant differences between countries within the same continent that speak the same language, let alone between countries on different sides of the globe. So we shouldn't assume that every part of our organisation has the same leadership and discipline customs. And therefore, using a user guide is quite an important consideration, because it will be difficult for staff to comply with the policy if they do not understand it. So while the language in the policy statement is presumably safe from an administrative and legal perspective, staff members may simply not understand what it actually means. So it is therefore important to maybe consider engaging a professional writer to develop a user guide. So this is a document that is intended to be understood by all staff members, regardless of whether they are technically proficient, security proficient, or legally proficient. So it's written in a manner that engages the normal layperson and maintains their interest and explains requirements to them in a way that can be easily understood. And if you've got a professional writer interview the policy writer, if you have a professional writer interview the policy writer, then these questions are more likely to be answered, and the writing style of the user guide is likely to be more in keeping with the goal of educating the audience. So these are some guidelines about how to make the policy as effective as possible. What do you think are some of the common criticisms of policies? So stop the video for a second and just pause. Maybe policies, as I mentioned earlier, that you've come across. What do you think are common problems and criticisms? So basically, one very common criticism of policies and standards is that they often can tell people what they cannot do, but rarely tell people what they can do. So it's important, therefore, to test out a number of actual scenarios that staff members are faced with and determine how the policy supports or inhibits them. So consider including a section in a user guide, as discussed earlier, that outlines common situations that people may find themselves in, and then describe how they can do their work. So we're going to see here an example. So for example, what if a staff member is working remotely and staying in a hotel? How would you respond if a line of business can make a legitimate case for the use of cloud technology? What about the use of personal cloud service? How will the policy work with a bring your own device program? If another organisation has control over your information, for example because of outsourcing, how will this work when the policy changes? Will the vendor continue to use the old policy, or will there be a commercial implication to switch to the new policies? So use high-profile events reported in the media or important new legal developments to develop scenarios for verifying the extent to which your policy protects your organisation. And how will you therefore ensure compliance? What do we need to consider? So what we do need to think about is the policy can only be effective if we can verify compliance. So what we might want to do is consider going through each policy requirement and expressly considering the following questions. So if a user asks you, how do I comply? What specific measures will you recommend? How will you measure compliance? How will you detect non-compliance? And how will you report on compliance in terms of both the extent and the business value? And if you cannot verify compliance, then it's possible that the policy statement may be unenforceable. And this may eventually lead to a situation in which an auditor will issue an audit finding that you are unable to address. And more importantly, you are left with a control that is not fully effective in mitigating risks. So just some notes regarding this as we are now reaching the end of this session. So in terms of document lifetimes are suggestions only, and local preferences may vary. So local preferences may also dictate preferred locations for some of the content of the policy. For example, some organisations include security principles in the Enterprise Security Charter, whereas others actually include them in the policy. And another thing to be consistent of is using a consistent style. So the paper or the article keywords for use in requests for comments to indicate requirement levels, RFC for short, contains internationally accepted guidelines on the use of these words. So a couple of footnotes there for you to think about. So we've now finished this session on policies. Hopefully now you've got a much clearer idea on how to create an effective policy in terms of the process to follow, the language to use, taking into account international audiences, and therefore who should be involved in the development of a policy and maintaining it. Okay, so thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next session.